So in the last presentation, we talked about the Great Depression and the real causes of it, and hopefully you watched some of those video clips on some of the myths behind it. But now we're going to talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his approach in the New Deal. And I will tell you that FDR is one of the most well-known presidents in American history. He was also the president during World War II, so he's going to be a very significant president. I will also tell you that he ran won four times. And you might say, well, why is it? I thought presidents were only supposed to serve 2 terms. And that is the precedent that President Washington set when he was first elected. But FDR challenged that. There's nothing really in the Constitution that said, the original Constitution that is, that said that any president, that the president had to run only for 2 terms. So FDR runs as many times as people will elect him. He dies at the beginning of his 4th term, which is why he didn't serve 16 years. He only served 12. But they do make a constitutional amendment that limited that. So after FDR's long run in the presidency, they actually make it officially part of the Constitution. So that's just kind of a little tidbit. I will put a little biography on FDR that I think is really great, because I think it's interesting to know a little bit about FDR. He was stricken with polio in his young age, around in his 30s or so. And so that played a big role in the way he spoke to people, how he did it, and I think a lot about him and his personality too. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on a little bit here. All right, so FDR becomes president in 1933. When he's inaugurated, the unemployment was at the worst rate in United States history. He gives a very famous speech, and part of the video clip that you'll watch there is about the speech. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself. And so he makes that very famous speech and says those words. And, FDR was very much a great communicator, too. He promotes, decisive federal government actions in order to fight the Depression itself. And he buys into an idea called the deficit spending, which is actually pretty controversial as economists go. Basically, the idea that it's okay to cause debt if you're trying to revive the economy, okay? And so I know that we looked at a graph before, but this just kind of drives the point home on how much of a landslide it was in 1932 for FDR to win this election. So he wins again really, really big over Herbert Hoover. Okay. So when FDR became president, and this is a good graph to really take a look at, the stock market crashed in 1929, and you can kind of see a slow, steady growth in unemployment. Okay, and the number of people that are unemployed. When he's inaugurated president, you can see this. This is his first New Deal, and you can see he really does make quite a bit of inroad into that. Okay, but there's a slight recession in 1938. That actually affects, and we go up again, and not quite at the high here, obviously, in unemployment. And so he initiates a second New Deal, which we'll talk about. World War II begins. The United States does not get into World War II until 1941. But you can see what really gets America out of the Great Depression completely, and this is where some of FDR's critics come in, was the production, the massive Allied production in World War II. Okay. However, I will tell you this. My personal theory is that had it not been FDR, then things might have been much worse, and might have gotten much worse. And so I always tell people FDR may not fit as a president for a lot of people and in many situations, but he was definitely the right president at the right time in the United States. And so, and we'll talk about why it is that I believe that. Okay. So the first 100 days. FDR absolutely knew that it was going to be critical for him to attack the banking crisis, because as he saw it, this was the #1 thing that was really sinking the United States. Okay, so he does something called a bank holiday. Okay, so this is going to be kind of important. So what FDR does is this, and he does this in his fireside chats that I'll explain, his first fireside chat that I'll explain here in just a moment. But essentially what he did was he closed all of the banks, and he told the American people he was going to do this before this happened. I'm going to close all banks for 4 days, okay? And for 3 of those days, the people in the federal government were going to examine each one of these banks. And if the banks were healthy, he was going to reopen those banks. Okay? Most of the banks were not healthy, so he only opened a small amount of banks. Okay? So interesting, though, too, that he told the American people that he was going to do this, but he called them to action. He said, this is what you have to do. Once we reopen these banks, you have to go back and put your money back into these banks, because if we don't do that, we're not going to recover as a country. And so he lays that on the American people and says that that's critically important for them to do. And, with this and with the reopening, people slowly gain some confidence back in the bank, and also because he institutes something known as the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is still around today, and it basically guarantees a certain amount of money if you deposit your money into a bank. And today, I think that amount is $250,000. I believe when they first established it, it was $2,500. Okay, but yeah, his banking holiday definitely helps. So take a look. The number of bank failures you can see in 1933. This is probably because of the bank closures, but you can see even before that, the banks were failing like crazy, okay? And then you can see the huge drop, and obviously that really helps. First of all, the number of banks that were out there, but also the fact that FDR was willing to take a look at those banks and make sure only the ones that were healthy would open back up. Okay, just like I mentioned previously, FDR does a weekly address on the radio, and remember in the 1920s the radio was a central part of American culture at the time, and so he utilizes that to communicate to the American people what he is doing, the daily goals, and what he needs the United States people to do. And so he very much was about, people helping the country and helping out, get the country back on its feet, but he also knew very clearly that he was the leader of that country, and it was important for him to lead the American people to that. Okay, and so he's very popular in his fireside chats and gives American people confidence back into the federal government. Okay, so let me just move this down. I think I'm blocking this a little bit here. But essentially, one of my favorite people in American history of all time is Eleanor Roosevelt. She was an amazing, amazing woman. And she completely transforms the role of the First Lady. So used to be the First Lady was simply just the wife of the president, but Eleanor Roosevelt was incredibly intelligent, politically savvy. She tours the United States and promotes FDR's programs and talks to women in particular. And so she's the first one really to engage this way. She writes a daily newspaper, and she also is a staunch advocate of human rights, specifically African American rights. She absolutely disagreed with segregation, and she will push her husband to do things he doesn't quite comfortable with. He does some things for African Americans. However, she would have enjoyed that quite a lot more. I will tell you that after his death in 1945, she was our first United Nations representative, and she co-writes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's still in the books in the United Nations today. So pretty amazing woman, Eleanor Roosevelt. That's why I wish I could spend more time talking about her. Okay, so FDR's New Deal was a 3-tier program. Okay, so relief, recovery, and reform. So his programs that he initiates will fall in at least one, sometimes more than one of these areas. Okay, so relief, he knew he needed to give American people immediate relief. Okay, we might today understand that because relief checks were recently given to us by the administration. That was the kind of thing that FDR was looking for. Recovery, he needed to stimulate industry, agriculture, factories, things like that, in order to end the Great Depression. And the other one was reform. He needed to take a hard look at some, not just industries within the United States, but mainly like the federal government and how they were operating, and he needed to revise and reform those programs in order to make it so the United States wouldn't fail again and go into another Great Depression. Okay, so what are some examples of some of the relief programs? Okay, the relief programs, one of the biggest things they did was employ people. The federal government employed, tens, hundreds of thousands of people by the end of the Great Depression. Not all at one time. But one of those examples is the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. They built roads. They did all kinds of infrastructure projects. This hires like young, able-bodied men, and where they could earn money and provide for their families. Okay, another example is the Public Works Administration, and they hired 2 million people, and again, infrastructure, this time airports, schools, things like that. Okay, so that's an example of some of the early relief programs. Some of the recovery programs, basically they were designed to stimulate industry and agriculture. The AAA was the Agriculture Adjustment Act, and remember I talked about in the previous lecture about how they were overproducing in farms. And so the AAA literally asked them to pay them to not produce. And so it was like, it helped reduce the amount of supplies of agriculture so they could raise the prices. And so, it does work and does help farmers. Doesn't quite stimulate the economy. Plus, later on, it's going to be ruled, this program is going to be ruled unconstitutional, by the way. So it doesn't completely work, but definitely helps a little bit. All right, some reform programs were there to address kind of the weaknesses in the American economy. We need to fix particular things to help them. And one of those is one I mentioned, the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And that essentially insures people's money in the bank so that people would gain confidence. And that definitely works. That is still there today. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which is still there today too, but it was there to help a lot of the rural communities. It gave them electricity, it gave them jobs, and so it provided like cheap hydroelectric power. So the TVA does quite a few things. It's some more examples of that. Okay, so anyway, that was just the first New Deal and how that happened. Okay, so we're going to have critics of the New Deal. And so we have a lot of critics on federal government spending and the deficit, but we also have critics that don't actually think that the federal government is doing enough. And probably the loudest voice was a Louisiana senator known as Senator Huey Long. His idea was the Share the Wealth program. And he said anybody who, I'm covering up his name, I'm sorry. Anybody who makes over $1 million should be paying back a huge tax. They should give every U.S. family, not every person who makes over $1 million, but we should tax people making over $1 million to the point where we're able to give every family $2,500 a year. And he was like a very vocal critic, was on the radio, really, criticizing FDR in this program, saying it's just not doing enough. And so this is one of his most famous speeches. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people? The only way you'd ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub that he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the houses. But then they've got everything on God's loving earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in. And all that their children can live in and wear and eat. And all their children's can use. Then we got to call Morgan, Mellon, Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. So his argument obviously was that people like Rockefeller and Mellon, they didn't need all that money, and so they should be giving back a portion of their money to the United States. Okay, obviously it doesn't work. It does definitely border on socialism, maybe even communism, but ironically too, he was planning to run for president, but he is assassinated. He was kind of a corrupt person too. He's got a long history there. So probably one of the most justifiable criticisms of FDR was the court packing plan. Now, recently you might have heard this from some Democrats, but it's been pretty, well, I don't know, pretty dismissed recently. It may be partially because this was already tried by FDR and it was extremely unpopular. So also in the Constitution, besides the number of years that a president can serve in the original Constitution, there's really no limit on the number of Supreme Court justices you can have. The Constitution does not address that. And as a matter of fact, it was just created by, a congressional law on how that was that we have created that many 9 Supreme Court justices. So during this time, one of the reasons why FDR is so able to pass so many of these legislative bills is because they were all Democrats in Congress too. So when you have like-minded people in the 2 branches of government, it makes it a lot easier to push through these ideas. But not so much in the Supreme Court. It was still pretty conservative. 2 of his recovery programs, the Agriculture Adjustment Act, and the NRA is not the NRA you're thinking of. It was the National Recovery Act. It helped to stimulate industry and business. These were both declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because it violated, according to the Supreme Court, the Interstate Commerce Act, because it was regulating, federal government was regulating trade within a state, okay? And according to the Constitution, the only way you can regulate trade is if it crosses state lines. And so, these 2 things are thrown out. FDR is super angry about this, and he threatens, and he wants to actually pack the court with 6 additional justices that would throw off the balance and favor his decisions, okay? He comes pretty close to doing this. But even the Democrats were uncomfortable with this idea, and they kind of encouraged him not to do it. There's actually a clip on his court packing plan that I put in here too, so I encourage you to watch that. And so he doesn't do this. I will tell you the Supreme Court, although it wasn't perfect, they'd certainly stopped throwing out a lot of his programs. That quieted things down. But the biggest thing is that most people saw this, even many, many Democrats saw this as an overstep of his power and violation of the Constitution. Okay, so in 1935, FDR is elected again, and he creates another aggressive series of a New Deal called the Second New Deal. Okay, his most ambitious program by far of his relief programs in the Second New Deal was the Works Progress Administration. This now, remember the PWA, Public Works Administration, created 2 million. This one creates 10 million jobs. But it's not just like public works and infrastructure that the WPA did. They also hired teachers, doctors, all kinds of different types of people, all walks of life. And they were heavily involved in many things, also to promote tourism in many other cities, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, okay? So all kinds of different things the WPA does. And one really interesting thing is that the WPA, Works Progress Administration, created the Riverwalk in 1938. And so I want you to think about how important that is to the city of San Antonio, because San Antonio is actually the #1 tourist destination in Texas. And I would argue that it's not so much the Alamo as it is the Riverwalk that attracts so many people to San Antonio. And so I want you to also think about how important that program has been to, San Antonio, because a big, huge part of the San Antonio economy is tourism. Okay, and so yeah, I find that interesting. You could go down to the Riverwalk and actually see that plaque too. Kind of cool. Okay, so probably may even be his most important of all of his programs is Social Security. So most of, if not all of you work, and so you look at your check every week or 2 weeks or every month, and Social Security is taken out. Okay, so that was under FDR's Second New Deal, and it was done because there was absolutely no plan for people who were elderly. They couldn't work. They didn't have any ability to work. Also, there were some people that were physically unable, either some sort of physical ailment or mental ailment. They're not able to work. And so this was the first time we ever had any kind of pension program. It was seen as kind of the first welfare program. Okay. The next thing that happens, and this is a big shift in the way that labor unions were looked at before. FDR was definitely seen as a very pro-labor union person, and he was very well aware that a lot of companies absolutely refused to hire anybody that was associated with a union. Okay, and so the Congress pushes through something through Congress called the Wagner Act, which gave unioners the right to strike and collectively bargain. And you can see the massive amount of union membership after the Wagner Act just absolutely increases astronomically. Okay, and his programs, he was really popular. FDR is absolutely slaughtering his competition. There's hardly anybody that goes against him. So in 1936, he wins really with no problem. Okay, I will also say that this was definitely his most challenging term financially because of the fact that we did hit a recession in 1938. This is first New Deal, second New Deal, and so it seemed like initially his first New Deal helped, but it's steadily it didn't help as much in the American economy. And so, you know, people say, well, was it successful? Was it not successful? And I've kind of laid out a lot of the arguments for and against. It's up to you how you historically interpret it, and what happened. But the people that go against it really were saying it was too expensive. Unemployment, when FDR begins to back off federal government jobs, unemployment rose. So it was just like, just kind of covering up the bigger problem. And they also said that FDR's programs don't actually end the Depression. It was World War II. However, the people that say that it's successful say that it really did help people through the Great Depression. I mean, leaving people in poverty in Hoovervilles were not a positive thing, right? Also, the federal government took an absolutely powerful role in helping the government and the people, and sets a precedent that in times of crisis, it's the federal government's job to help the American people, that's really what their purpose was. Also under his presidency, African American inequity was addressed. He actually did have, people, federal government officers that were African American. So although he didn't make the great strides maybe we would have liked him to do during that time period, he certainly made more strides than people previous to him. Okay, so now you should be able to answer the questions for the reflection and be able to take the quiz. Good luck, and I will talk to you all next week.